Hello everyone, welcome to another of Cohere's podcasts from the Are We All Listening series. My name's Edmund Page, I'm the CEO of Cohere, and I'm very happy to be joined today by Vanessa Ishimwe. Vanessa is a member of Cohere's Refugee Advisory Panel, among many of the other hats that she wears. And Vanessa, good to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Vanessa, perhaps before you tell us all about the different roles that you have, the different innovations that you're part of, you could start by a bit about your history and how you ended up in Uganda, where you are now, and anything you'd like to share about your background.
My name is Vanessa Ishimwe. I am originally from Rwanda. I came in Uganda with my mother after my father's death. I came with my mom and three siblings, me being the fourth. And we came in 2008, towards the end of 2008. We first settled in Kampala as urban refugees because all my life and my mother's life, we had always lived in the city. So that's where we first lived. But because we lived there as refugees with my mom failing to get work, even when she worked as an accountant for more than 7 years while she was still in Rwanda, she couldn't get a job. So it was hard to sustain our living there. Then we had to move to the refugee settlement where we could get at least access to free housing as that, and some other humanitarian assistance for us to be able to survive. So we went to Chakatu refugee settlement in a year that I do not remember, but I feel like I've been there almost all my life. But that's how I came to be in Uganda and in Chakatu refugee settlement, where I have lived for over 17 years now.
So what has your experience been like in Chaka? What was it like when you first got there, and how did you end up getting involved in all the community projects that you're involved in now?
Initially, we just settled there. I think I was really, really young. By then, I think my first worries were to go back to school. And for the bigger part of my life, because again, my mother had been the one taking care of all four of us. Me and my siblings were going to school before we went to the refugee settlement. And she couldn't do that at a certain point. I think when I finished Senior 4, which is the fourth year of secondary, and then I stopped. But even between me studying between Senior 1 to Senior 4, I still had a lot of, school dropout. I would get out and then back and then out and then back again. And for about 5 years, I didn't go back to school to finish secondary education. And during that gap, that's where I found friends that were sort of facing or had faced similar circumstances of lack of education, being unemployed, being unable to do anything, just staying at home. So we decided to work together to be able to support ourselves, but also to support the community in trying to, mobilize young people. We started with mobilizing young people to go and plant trees. And then we had a bunch of other programs that we did, like having a saloon, rearing goats to be able to earn a living, to which later we settled with running an early childhood education center that started in a church and actually started under a tree in one of the founding members' yard. So that's how I got to start getting involved with what is currently known as YIDA, Youth Initiative for Development in Africa, that I no longer work with, but have worked with for the biggest part of my journey in the community work.
Thank you. So I didn't realize that you started off by planting trees. That's really interesting. How did you come up with that activity among all the things you could have done?
I think we tried everything that we could try. We had planting trees, and then there was James who was teaching the nursery kids, and then there was Baraka who who had a salon and had this art stuff that he was doing. So we were trying, I think, almost everything that we could to be able to sort of survive, but also kind of have it as a community building, like coming together, like an activity that we do together as young people who are out of school, or for those who are in school during holidays, and as a way of trying to support ourselves and support the community. I think we kind of had borrowed the idea as well from already existing organization that had been there called Ciota. It's Koburas. I think many people know it as Koburas. And they had, the idea mostly had come from James being part of that community of people who had sustained themselves through growing food, planting things and selling them, and rearing animals and helping some people to go to school through doing that. And kind of the same idea came through for us because that was happening in Changwai refugee settlement. So it came through for us also to do something similar in Chaka too.
Fantastic. And so James, you're referring to the co-founder of VIDA, James Gahoma. Did either you or James have connections with donors or funders from outside of Chaka, or when you got started, were you mainly tapping into existing resources and existing opportunity and community buy-in within Chaka?
We never had any donors from or any supporters from outside Chaka. James was very, very good at mobilizing the community. James and Baraka, actually, Baraka is also one of the other co-founders. They were very good at mobilizing young people to come together and contribute some little bit of money if they have it. But most of the work that we did in the initial stages was not even, it wasn't a lot funded by money. It was funded by our own hard work. So, for example, we built the first structure of the current school, which no longer exists because it was really, really old. But we built it by going to ask for trees from the community and breed, fetch the water. We would, make the mud ourselves. And every day we came with at least some bit of material to build that structure.
So when you opened the school, did parents pay any school fees, or was everyone working as volunteer with virtually no money changing hands?
In the beginning, most people were working as volunteers, and the teachers, the parents would contribute what they have at some point. They would contribute very, very little money, which wouldn't even pressure them to pay, honestly. In the beginning, they would just come, bring the children, they study, to are still under the shade or under the half-finished classroom, and the teachers also would just volunteer their time and teach the children. And if we had any money at all, it would be distributed to the teachers who are doing the work, who are taking care of the kids every day.
So you're talking about events that happened around 10 years ago now when the school was open. Do you know what any of the children who first registered at the nursery school would be up to now?
I may not know all of them, but a few of them I know are in primary 5, 6, and 7, and some of them still study at the either schools. Actually, some of those children are the ones who inspired the building of a primary school for Yita, because they would finish a class and then would see that there was a need for them to continue in another class, and then would have that class. And for some time, we only had the kindergarten section of the schools until we just saw there was a need for us to, still bring a primary school that provides quality education for refugee children in Chaka. And then we started with the same ones that we had. Some of them are in primary 5 and 6 at the Ida school, and others I wouldn't know. We weren't very good at keeping very many records at the time, but I'm pretty sure because we're still within the same community where we started the school, where if I had to look for them, I would find them. And I'm sure James or Baraka has connections to those children.
One of the things that always inspired me about UDA when I went to visit Chaka was the income generating activities that you ran alongside the socially focused projects, if you like the school and the environmental work. For example, you had a financial services company running on one of the main streets in Chaka refugee settlement. How did you come up with an idea to do that? It's quite different from running a nursery school.
The idea came from teachers, surprisingly. The teachers would want us, for example, because we were paying very little money, I mean, as much as we could gather from parents at the time, and since we didn't have any major donors to fund our activities, so we'd pay the teachers, and sometimes the money wouldn't be enough, and they would require loans or advances for them to be able to run their projects on the side. So we kind of took the idea from them and decided we needed to create. Initially, it was supposed to be a microfinance sort of business that allows people to get loans and do their work and then bring back the money. But along the way, I found that the logistics of it was a little bit complicated, and we for now settled with the money remittance, which is really a good business that would then, because we knew, even in the beginning, we knew that the money that we were going to make out of that business was supposed to still support the school, still support the humanitarian kind of non-profit work that we were doing. And when we landed on the idea, seeing that many people go 2 districts away from Chaka to get money that is sent to them from abroad, we decided we could do that. And the profits that come out of the money remittance business would still be working towards supporting the work that we were doing in the schools and the rest of the humanitarian work that we were doing.
And this is also an approach that you've taken on outside of UDA in your own life and your own work with the project that you started on the side, Authentic Africa Works.
So Authentic Africa Works, I actually started it, like you said, as a side project while I was still working at UDA. And the idea had come from the school that I went to. After senior 4, and didn't go to school, found the scholarship, and then went to this school that supported us to study for free, we just pay for uniform. And after senior 6, like after we'd completed secondary school, some of us would go to work in a factory that made leather products as a way of raising tuition for their university. And others would have a project that they would run a community project in there during the holidays to support a cause or to kind of work on a problem that they are passionate about. Now, I was one of those people that worked on a problem that I was passionate about, and the problem that I was passionate about was school dropout for girls. And but somehow it looked a lot like what that other factory or the other business, the other girls were doing, which was raising money through making leather products and selling them and getting school fees. So once the program was over, because it was a 9-month program, once the program was over, I got a friend of mine and decided we could do the same thing, especially since even when you do do a business for about 9 months and you can get so much school fees or tuition. So we still needed money at the end of the day. And I still saw that I still needed to support other people, my friends, and some people from my community. And I thought that would be a good thing to replicate within the refugee setting, especially since it's like making leather products. You just need to be trained for a month or 2, and then you can learn the rest on the job. And that can not only give you annual living, but also the aim was to make sure that we get some girls to school. it has evolved. Currently, we are focusing on supporting refugee women leaders in order to advance economic opportunities, but also inclusion of women leaders and women voices in decision-making processes. So while we still do make the leather products, the aim is now for that business to be able to support the work that we are doing. And I think it's a good approach because it sustains the humanitarian work for a few months while we're still trying to, raise funds to support the work that we're doing with the women-led RLOs.
Fantastic. And when you started working in a refugee-led organization 10, 12 years ago, there weren't by any means as many refugee-led initiatives in Uganda or even worldwide as there are now. And there are various reasons for that, not least because the refugees in Chaka hadn't been there for so long to be able to get established, be able to start community initiatives that could actually be sustainable. Mm-hmm. While at the same time, the international humanitarian sector has had to, or chosen to, whichever way you look at it, to retreat back or peel back the layers of support they're able to provide in Uganda as well as many other countries in Africa. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the spotlight during COVID and then also during other crises like the Ebola outbreak in Mubende a couple of years ago, which directly impacted Chaka refugee camp being only about 50 kilometers away. There's finally a bit more recognition of the work that refugee leaders are doing in communities. And I think the story that you told about how UDA was started and how Authentic African Works began demonstrates the relevance, the appropriateness, the sustainability of the work that refugee leaders do. I imagine you've learned a huge amount from that experience. And I like the way you're saying you want to now work with refugee leaders, but particularly women leaders. So you're kind of moving into a different level of humanitarian work, whereby you're trying to support leaders who are going through experiences that you've gone through. But it still can be hard, I think, for people who are not within communities to know what women leaders are doing. There can be a challenge when you look around the number of refugee-led organizations in Uganda, for example. The vast majority that you see at the moment are led by men. And actually there are a lot of women-led initiatives out there. What do you think are the reasons behind why many of the RLOs that come to the forefront in Uganda are led by men?
I'm actually doing research on that. So the question is quite timely. I think there is a number of reasons why women-led organizations do not come at the forefront. One of them might be a bit controversial, but mostly women that I've met, even the women leaders, when I was doing the interviews, their way of leading does not include, being like, I want to use the word aggressive out of lack of a better word to use, but they're not getting out there, fighting for the sport to speak, raising their hands, because that is how people get recognized. That is how I remember, I think Ida and myself as an individual got to be recognized by getting out there, raising my hand to ask a question even when I didn't think that the question made sense. So for many women, they're more into their community, and it's sometimes challenging, intimidating to be on platforms where there is many people and kind of feel like you maybe don't have the capacity the confidence to kind of ask the question and to be noticed. I think the idea around women-led organizations has been that they lack capacity, but even the men-led organizations, like I said, we started from a point where we were just students 10 years ago, and we had no idea what we were doing, and we learned on the job. And I think and we learned on the job because we kept pushing, and we kept being recognized, and we kept learning, and we kept being shown the right way to go. And for these women, again, if they are mostly in their community and they are sometimes afraid and not confident to raise their hand, and maybe they're not built to, struggle for their voice to be heard, or to insist on a point, or to insist to be understood and to be let to speak, or to be given the opportunity to express their work and their interests. They tend to be categorized as not having the capacity, and yet they're not intentionally sought. They're doing amazing work, and if we gave them the boost, they would be able to, spread their wings and to kind of scale the work that they are doing, and they would be maybe more confident if they approached more platforms and did this many times. If they spoke many times, they would be maybe more conversant to do that. I think that is how I got to be able to be recognized, because I did it over and over again. And if we haven't given all the women-led organizations that much time to learn, or that much grace and understanding that if we need something, it won't happen exactly right now, because we still have a long way to learn, and we kind of need to also meet them right where they are, and also find them in the community. And usually, people who support refugee-led organizations tend to think that the refugee-led organizations will find them in their offices in Kampala or in Nairobi or in Geneva, wherever they are. And yet, to many people, they don't maybe even have the transport to go into that networking event, but they're doing tremendous work in their community. So I think we need to find them at their level, and also give them grace, and also know that there is need for them to learn and grow. That needs time.
I think it's ironic that you say women leaders are more into their community, and what I took from that is they're more focused on the community work. They're more focused on working with the most marginalized and the most vulnerable in their community. My experience anecdotally is that all the women leaders we work with are very focused on being inclusive, working with the most marginalized, and just having that genuine commitment for their community, far over and above, presenting themselves on platforms or grandstanding or trying to get to international. It's not saying that anyone in particular is guilty of doing that, but the women leaders are so distracted with the real work they're doing that they possibly, like you say, are not presenting themselves within the international humanitarian sector. But I guess the question is the onus on them to do that better, as I would prefer to think of it. Is the onus actually on the humanitarian sector and on donors and INGOs or whoever to be far more proactive and far more open-minded about approaches to how to partner with women-led organizations? We learned this the hard way. We've certainly made mistakes as Cohere. In 2021, we did a call for proposals for partnerships across Kenya and Uganda, which, by the way, we haven't done since, for reasons I'll explain. And out of 150 organizations that applied, only 2 were women-led. And for a couple of years, when people asked me where the women-led organizations were in Kenya and Uganda, I would say, well, there aren't really many, because we only had 2 applicants out of 150. And there was so much wrong with that. One of the problems was that we generally put the advert out in English. Leaders fill in a form in English, which had to be accessed online. And already right there, you have so many barriers whereby women who may have not had the same privileges as male leaders, depending on which country they come from, in many cases they didn't even know that we had a call for applications out. And one of the reasons that we've stopped doing these calls for partnerships is that you'll always have those barriers. You'll almost always be exclusionary. Even when you try to I think, to create more accessible formats, I think the most inclusive way to build partnerships is to really just have a real presence on the ground and know who those innovators are. You may even have women leaders who don't even feel confident in their literacy levels to fill in forms in whichever language you ask them to do, but are doing amazing work with the most vulnerable in a community, maybe not even with any finances at all. This is clearly one of the areas that you want to innovate within. So what are the plans that you've got? What are the next step plans you've got to build relationships with other women-led initiatives?
Actually, while you were speaking, I remembered that when you said women leaders could be possibly preoccupied with the work that they're doing in the community, that they don't get on the different platforms, global platforms, or to present themselves and their work. I just remembered that actually for very many women, they are not just leading the RLOs, but also they are supporting their families and having children. And I've found that this work, that especially when you're working and starting from scratch, you require a lot of time to be able to be recognized, to be able to do the work in the community, but also be able to present yourself on global platforms. And women kind of have work from the time that they wake up to the time they go to sleep, with their families, with their children, with their organizations. So with now limited resources, I feel like that also is a barrier that hinders them from, accessing and being accessed by different stakeholders. To sort of go into what you were talking about, it's important to, and this is something that I'm working on, to create a bridge between the people who are in very huge offices in Kampala or in Nairobi or whatever they are, and the people, the leaders in Chakatu, the leaders in Ramwanja refugee settlement, the leaders in Kakuma. There needs to be an intermediary. And that intermediary, and this is what I'm trying to do again, has to be also rooted in the community, but also can be able to access the global platforms, to be able to link, to act as the bridge between these different stakeholders, the women-led organizations and their supporters and the people who are looking to support them, but also the different actors in the humanitarian spaces have to be intentional about building relationships between themselves and refugee-led organizations or refugee women-led organizations, because they keep saying and writing proposals and spending a lot of money in supporting women empowerment, but then they don't make it an intention to actually meet them where they are and understand how they lead and understand how they live and understand what their actual challenges are and how better they can redesign the programs to suit the way these women are leading, the way these women are working, the way these women are living. I think it would be counterproductive to keep injecting money. And I hear this a lot whenever I tell anyone that I'm working to support refugee women to scale their impact and to also grow and be recognized and to be included. So I think it's important to do this work to kind of bridge the gap between the supporters and the refugee women-led organizations in the community, but also it has to be intentional from the side of whoever it is that is wanting to work or inject money, time into the work that women leaders are doing.
I completely agree with you. I find it amazing the reluctance that international community has to, in your words, meet women-led organizations where they are. The challenge or the barrier that keeps being brought up by the international donors is this idea around organizational capacity. This myth that, it's not a myth because it is an actual barrier that they bring up, that women-led or small locally led organizations don't have the capacity to receive their funding. But the point that I mentioned in the last podcast, but I'll say it again, I'll probably say it in future podcasts, is that the most marginalized that the women are working with, the most vulnerable in any community, do not care about organizational capacity in the way that the donors view it and describe it. It makes no difference to them whether women-led organizations have all of the different paperwork and policies and systems in place that the donors need. And it baffles me that the donors don't see the conflict in trying to demand these things as if it's going to have any benefit at the local level without realizing that often it might even take away from the work that they're able to do. But nevertheless, there is a small number of donors out there that are specifically interested and open to funding refugee-led organizations, and an even smaller number specifically interested in funding women-led, refugee-led organizations. And whether it's to do with capacity or even just connecting, I totally agree that the bottleneck is huge, with a small number of potential donors and a huge number of refugee-led initiatives. I've been banding around the number of 3,000 in Africa. It could be any number, really. We've got over 520 refugee-led organizations that have created a profile on Reframe Network, which is the platform that we created for RLOs to profile their work. But that could be a small percentage of the number of RLOs in Africa, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. And yet the number of donors explicitly interested in funding RLOs would be between 10 or 20 internationally at the moment. What do you see are some of the opportunities, but also the gaps in playing that role as a connector or an intermediary between the huge number of RLOs, including the large number of women-led organizations that actually do exist, and the small number of donors?
Starting with the challenge that there is a small number of donors, be it institutional or individual donors, that are looking to, within their work, to support refugee-led initiatives or refugee-led organizations. Someone would argue that it's not just amongst refugees, it's just global, that the humanitarian support is dwindling. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that means it's even getting even smaller for refugee-led organizations. I think that's a challenge that we still kind of think about different innovative ways of supporting refugee-led organizations or asking them to support themselves. But going back to the different kind of restricted funding, the lack of capacity, as they say, that refugee-led organizations lack the capacity. I want to sort of say something that may sound like I would be in agreement with the people that say that refugee-led organizations lack capacity. They do not. It's not like they lack capacity. They just don't look like what you deem capacity is, if that makes sense. Some organizations could be really starting, and like you said, they might be doing a lot of work within the community, and the community doesn't care whether they have the papers, whether they have they've registered or something like that. But if I think they are choosing to take institutional funding, objectively, I think that they kind of, because there is a system that has already been set, and some of the funding that is coming through these other organizations, through these other institutions, is already restricted at even deeper, higher levels that we may not be able to disrupt at the moment. And in the times where they are unable to do that for themselves, I mean, the refugee-led organizations are unable to maybe provide the huge file of papers that they need to present to the funder to be able to get them funding. And I think that's where organizations like Cohere, or what I'm trying to do with Authentic African Works, would come in. Have the paperwork, we have the people to, support in making sure that the fears around mismanagement of funds or being unable to reach the targets are reached. But however, again, it still puts a lot of pressure on the intermediary and the organizer and the refugee-led organization as well. I don't know how. This is something that is very that kind of I run around circles around it when I'm thinking about it, because I don't know exactly what the refugee-led organizations in this case would do. Because if we are focusing on making sure that we are reporting and giving these, we are meeting the due diligence processes of different organizations, and you find that a lot of money, like 70% of the budget is going, if you have any money, is going towards that, and 30% is barely reaching, the community, as we would say. So there are laws and systems that have been put in place that we may not be able to shake or disrupt right now. And in cases where that's not what we are going to change, I think we could find innovative ways like what Cohere is doing to sort of get the funding down to the people who are, most of the funding, I should add, most of the funding to the people who are doing the work in the community through intermediaries. And I think there is need, like you said, Cohere has been a monopolist in this case, so there is need for more intermediaries, especially led by refugees, to be able to reach and meaningfully engage and support and fund these initiatives that are done at the community level. While if that's refugee-led organizations aspire to be, for example, the kind that are, meeting these huge demands by different actors, then I think that's something that they can work towards. I don't personally see any problem with that. They couldn't work towards that. But I feel like the true impact is in making sure that we get a lot of, most of the funding, again, to the people who are doing the work in the community, because those are the communities that we are trying to support. Otherwise, we'll always have the same images of refugees, the same poor-looking with snot coming out of their nose kind of people in the news. And maybe you could argue that that's where some people or some institutions and some organizations want the community of refugees to remain, but I digress.
No, it's definitely on the point, because some refugee leaders might argue that, okay, 70% is going into wastage, like you described, and that could well be true if 70% of your staff have to be working on the original due diligence, the reporting, the financial accountability, the procurement processes, and everything that's needed to comply with donor obligations. But 30% of $1 million is still a lot of money if, you're looking at $300,000 out of $1 million. Whereas if you turn down restricted funding, you might only raise $20,000 from the very small number of donors willing to give flexible funding with no strings attached, where the funds can go directly to community leaders, which, by the way, is what Cohere is now only working with. But I do see the point, and when you match it with that point that you said about reframing the narrative around refugee leadership and maybe occupying more of that sphere, or more of the sector, really, of where in the past INGOs would have dominated, then maybe it's a price worth paying. Would you subscribe to that point of view?
I think restricted funding has its place, and so does unrestricted funding. It teaches you, the restricted funding, I can say, taught us to be organized, to track what we've done, to be able to put it in one sentence, to be able to present it in a way that the wider community would understand it, be it the funders or the community that we are working with. I think it has its space, and it's actually, I wouldn't demonize all of it. I would just say that I think it would be a good price to pay, because it has its advantages. And like you said, 30% of 1 million is 300,000, and that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. I can imagine how many things it could do within a community like Chaka or Pamwanja. It would do a lot. So And also one thing I'll add is that maybe we don't know, maybe we don't have access to the unrestricted funding, or refugee leaders just don't have the luxury to pick and choose most of the time, because what you have access to is what you get. Like, you get what you get. You get what you see, you take what you get. And usually we are even expected to be grateful for what we get, because that is what we get. So there is, as much as, and there isn't like a fair comparison between the institutional funding and the unrestricted funding from, say, individuals, because there isn't a connection between the individuals who are funding who are doing some unrestricted funding to refugee-led organizations or to refugee leaders, as much as, because the institutional funders are more loud and more present than the others. So, and they're doing a lot of, there is some good work that is happening because of the funding that is going there. It's not all bad. And I think just like they could be different, they could maybe do something differently, they could do better, but they also have their space in the humanitarian sector. And it's good to choose. It's good that Cohere chose, I guess, what to work with. But for refugees mostly, I think it would be good to diversify, especially because there is a disconnect between the unrestricted funding and there is more presence of the institutional funders. Yeah.
No, I agree. That's an agenda that's owned by donors. You gave the example of sometimes the restrictions come even from higher up. In other words, people who have literally never stepped foot in that community are deciding what's important on behalf of those people. And that's something I've got a problem with. But like a broken clock is correct twice a day, there are times when a donor-led agenda actually does match with the agenda of the most marginalized. And like you say, that means that restricted funding can do good in the way that the most marginalized genuinely want to see. I like what you're saying. I do agree. And I think it's important that refugee-led intermediaries come in and fill that space, acting as a buffer, if you like, between restrictions of donors and leaders who are wouldn't be able to access that funding for the reasons we've talked about, but also would be now freer to do more with that funding because maybe you as an intermediary are playing that role as a buffer. I also genuinely hope that if the buffer actor or the intermediary is a refugee-led organization, that the donors might be a bit more flexible than they were with us as Cohere and with other non-refugee-led intermediaries. That might be a silver lining to us pulling out of that role. But I could play devil's advocate here and share why some of these large grants with lots of zeros on the end are also, to an extent, a poison chalice, and see how you come back and whether because having said I agree, I also would want to just temper with some of my experiences and also some of my observations with trends that are happening at the moment. I think the first thing is that intermediaries unavoidably do get pinched in the middle between the donor agenda and the donor requests and the expectations of the communities you work with. So it's always a juggling game, acting as a buffer, yes, but that can become very stressful at times. And I think what we found was that your relationships at the community level are the most important relationships, and you don't want to jeopardize those just because of a donor-led way of thinking or a donor-led objective. The second thing is, unfortunately, and again, I really hope this doesn't happen with refugee-led intermediaries, donors aren't always true to their contract. I know it's shocking, but we've had quite a number of cases where we're talking quite famous, world-renowned organizations that have refused to pay a section of our contract latterly for reasons that I genuinely believe are unfair, or in some cases just genuinely dishonest. We have one donor now that owes us money and just not answering our calls. And this is a well-known large international organization. So I hope that doesn't happen to refugee-led intermediaries, because that can, again, really threaten your relationships at the community level. And then, of course, the third thing we've got to accept is that $1 million today, next year could suddenly be chopped because of all the massive cuts to global humanitarian funding. And there are expectations that have to be managed, again, with your downstream partners. So, yeah, you still have confidence in the approach. I think it's, everything you said is very valid, but maybe how would you also learn from your experiences at YIDA with the sustainable financing that you're able to access through things like the financial services company and the business side of what you're doing with Authentic African Works to sort of balance out these pressures?
I think everything has a risk factor in it. For the unrestricted funders, the ones who give, say, 20,000 or 10,000 instead of 1 million, you might still not be able to reach as many people as you were reaching in the beginning, which again also threatens the relationship you have with the communities that you're working with. And similar to what you said about institution funders with their expectations and their decisions and what they think is right, could also threaten your relationship. And I think all these things are things that are to be expected, challenges that are to be expected, and sort of in advance. Some of them might not be, you might not know in advance, but you can try as much as you can to predict them in advance and set measures that could support you when they do happen, or if they do happen, because we go in it hoping for the best. And like you said, leveraging, I want to say that for example, the financial services at HIDA or the business that I'm doing, all of these may not have been possible because, again, we were starting from scratch. Even the business that I'm running started from scratch with just my savings, but that wasn't enough. Any business, any income generating activity requires money. Money makes money, fortunately or unfortunately. And if you can start small, but you still need some bit of money to be able to grow, and to be able to grow to a certain level where you're able to now take back the profits to the work that you're doing. So, and I think some of the institutions that provide funding get their funding that way from, like a bigger company or a bigger business, and then they fund their philanthropic work or their CSR. So I think it's good to keep that in mind and keep the running a business, doing an income generating activity as like finding sustainable ways of running the organization as a way to mitigate the risk of being stabbed in the back by these different organizations. But I honestly don't know. There are things that I feel like can't be, easily changed or done away with. Like the institution funding especially. Again, it has a lot of bottlenecks. It has a lot of things that, the requirements that can put a lot of pressure even on the intermediaries, like you said. And I think maybe the pressure should be expected. And as much as you try to advocate for, I think, a change in whatever situation you have come up with, like, for example, me, any situation that I come up with, I'm trying as much as I can to give as much feedback as I can to improve both because you have to maintain the relationship with the person that is giving you the money, and you have to maintain the relationship with the person that you are serving, because at the end of the day, you might not be willing to accept or mention it, but even when you do not have the money, the community will just, you're not supporting them much if you do not have the funding to do the support that you need to support them. So where do we compromise? Where do we not compromise? Up to how much, and how do we maybe hold accountable the people that may stab you in the back. I don't know what can be done in between there. That is also a question that I am unable to answer. But I remember something that you said about maybe these institution funders being more lenient to refugee-led intermediaries or refugee-led organizations. And I am not sure that is true because, again, at the back of their mind, they think we do not have the capacity. You present to them that the thing is led by this organization, this institution, or this business is led by a refugee, and automatically they think, oh, there is no capacity here. There is, even when, I think I've seen this, that even when you have the things that they're asking for, as long as they don't look like their things, for example, you have a policy and it doesn't look like word for word the same as their policy, they'll say you do not have the capacity because they came to you with already a mindset that you do not have the capacity. So I don't know how lenient they are. Maybe it's evolving. Like I said, I started doing this more than 10 years ago. There has been a lot of change in that mindset, but there still is a long way to go. Yeah.
Sure. And I think if people like you keep on advocating and adding clarity to why it could be so different, then hopefully things will gradually change. You're a very thoughtful and committed leader, and I feel confident that you'll find a way to answer these tough and intractable questions. And we as Cohere are committed to continuing to partner with the work that you're doing with women-led organizations. And as a start, for anyone who does want to provide any support to Vanessa's project, there's a link to their Reframe profile, Authentic African Works, in the description. And that's where you can give an unrestricted donation where all of this wastage will be avoided and all of the stress and challenges that we've been talking about can be bypassed. And Vanessa and her team can be free to really support women leaders to do what they're doing with the most marginalized in their communities. So thank you so much for coming today, Vanessa, to share about your life and your work and your plans for the future. There's always so much more we could discuss, which maybe we will another time. And thanks to all of you for coming and joining us today and listening.
Thank you for having me.